They thought they could break him. They thought a few fines, a few threats, a few letters slipped into his mailbox would be enough to drive his family into silence. But what the HOA didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that the man they were trying to intimidate was no ordinary homeowner. He wasn't a man who bent under pressure, and he wasn't a man who feared confrontation. He was the city's fire chief, a leader who faced flames and chaos every day, a man trained to stand tall when others ran. And yet, in the quiet streets of his own neighborhood, the true fire began, not with smoke or sparks, but with the petty cruelty of an HOA determined to control him. They fined his family for grilling in their own yard. They tried to shame them. They tried to scare them. But fire cannot be controlled, not when it burns in the heart of a father determined to protect his family. This is the story of how an HOA's greed and arrogance led them to pick a fight they could never win. How their corruption was exposed, their power destroyed, and their empire reduced to ashes. And it all began with the smell of barbecue on a summer afternoon. It began with the faintest curl of smoke rising softly into the afternoon sky. A summer day in the quiet suburban neighborhood, lined with manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges, suddenly carried the warm aroma of charcoal and seasoned meat. In the backyard of a modest brick home, laughter carried over the fence. A family, proud, joyful, and together, had gathered around a grill. It was nothing extravagant, nothing that would raise alarm in any decent community. Just a cookout, just a celebration of life, the kind of simple moment that holds families together. But in this neighborhood, there were eyes always watching. Eyes that looked down from behind curtained windows. Eyes that judged what did not match their narrow vision of control. The HOA, a body that claimed to protect property values, saw everything as a threat. Even the smell of barbecue drifting down the street was enough to stir their wrath. It started as a letter. A thin envelope slipped into the family's mailbox the following morning, bearing the HOA's official stamp. Inside, cold words laid, out in precise language, a violation. Unauthorized use of open flame, they wrote, disruption of neighborhood peace. And at the bottom, a fine. Hundreds of dollars demanded, simply because a family chose to gather around their own grill. The father, a man of discipline and strength, read the letter quietly at his kitchen table. To the neighbors, he was just another resident, another homeowner who had signed his way into the HOA's jurisdiction. They didn't know who he really was. They didn't know the authority he carried beyond the uniform of everyday life. To them, he was a target. To them, he was someone to put in his place. The mother shook her head as she looked at the paper. The children asked questions they didn't understand. Why would they fine us for a barbecue? She whispered, as though even her voice could draw more punishment. The father said nothing, not yet. He folded the paper, placed it back in its envelope, and set it aside. But the HOA wasn't finished. Within days, more letters arrived. Each one colder, harsher, heavier with fines. The amount grew, stacked one atop another like bricks in a wall closing in on the family. By the second week, the HOA wasn't just citing them for the barbecue. Now it was noise violations, lawn violations, parking violations. They combed through every detail of the family's life, searching for ways to tighten the screws. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was control, a message, a reminder of who held power. And as the pressure grew, whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors kept their distance, too afraid of the HOA to show support. Others looked on with smug satisfaction, certain that the problem family was finally being taught a lesson. But still there were some quiet, sympathetic eyes who watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The father endured it all with a patience that unsettled those around him. He didn't lash out. He didn't argue at board meetings or shout across fences. He simply waited watching as the HOA tangled itself in its own net of rules and fines. What they didn't know was that patience was his weapon. Silence was his strategy. Then the day came when the HOA decided patience was weakness. They wanted a show of force. It was a Saturday afternoon, another warm summer day. The family gathered once more, determined not to be broken by the letters or the fines. Again, the grill was lit. Again, the aroma filled the air. And again, the HOA stirred from its shadow. This time, they didn't send a letter. They came in person. The HOA president, flanked by 2 board members, walked down the street with clipboards in hand. Their faces were rigid with self-importance, their voices sharp as they documented infractions right there on the spot. They snapped photos, scribbled notes, and pointed at the grill as though it were an act of rebellion. To them, it was. The mother stood near the fence, her arms crossed tight. The children sat quietly, their laughter silenced by the stares of strangers. And the father, still calm, still silent, stood by his grill as the HOA delivered its latest threat. A citation, a heavier fine, and this time a promise. If the family did not comply, further action would be taken. The board members left with satisfied smirks, convinced they had crushed the spirit of the family, convinced they had won. But as they walked away, the father's eyes followed them, steady and unflinching. Because in that moment, he decided it was time to stop being silent. That night, as the neighborhood slept, he sat alone at the kitchen table once more. This time, he did not fold the letter and set it aside. This time, he reached for a file, kept locked away in a drawer. Inside was not paperwork of a homeowner, but the badge and documents of the life he lived beyond this neighborhood. For the father was no ordinary man. He was the fire chief of the city, a man who commanded respect across every street, every department, every engine that carried the weight of saving lives. He understood the laws better than any HOA president. He enforced safety codes that stretched across the city. And now, he was staring at the reckless arrogance of an HOA that had just walked into his world without realizing it. He leaned back, in his chair, the badge resting on the table, and let out a slow breath. For weeks, he had allowed them to push, to harass, to pile fine upon fine. But now, the smoke wasn't just from his barbecue. The smoke was a signal, a warning, a beginning. Because the next time fire trucks rolled down this street, they wouldn't be coming for him. They would be coming because of him, and the HOA had no idea what was about to descend upon them. The morning after the confrontation, the neighborhood looked calm on the surface. Sprinklers hissed in perfect rhythm across emerald green lawns. A jogger moved past the cul-de-sac. Delivery vans dropped packages on doorsteps. To anyone passing by, it was a scene of ordinary suburban peace. But inside one particular brick home, the air was heavy with decision. The father, now no longer, just a quiet homeowner. But the fire chief knew the time for silence had ended. The badge that had rested on his table the night before was not just a symbol of his work. It was power. It was authority. It was a reminder that while the HOA thrived on rules and petty control, true law was something far greater. For years, he had walked the delicate line between duty and privacy. In his role as fire chief, he had overseen everything from catastrophic blazes to citywide safety codes. His name carried weight in every government office, every department, every courtroom. But in this neighborhood, he had kept that identity hidden, choosing instead to be known as just another man who came home tired at the end of a shift. HOA's arrogance had shattered that. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes fell on the growing stack of fines. Each paper bore the same message: control, intimidation, humiliation. The barbecue had been the first excuse, but the board had shown their true hand. They didn't care about fire codes or safety. They cared about dominance. And now, They had made the mistake of targeting the one man who could expose every weakness in their little empire. The father began to plan, not with anger, not with rash vengeance. His mind worked the way it always had when commanding his department, calmly, strategically, methodically. First, he reviewed the HOA's rules and bylaws. He knew the patterns, vague restrictions dressed up as community standards, but he also knew the city's fire safety laws, and there it was, written in plain code, the right of homeowners to use outdoor cooking appliances within certain safety guidelines. The HOA's fine had no legal ground. They had overstepped, inventing their own authority where none existed. He smiled faintly. That was the first crack in their armor. Next, he pulled files from his department. Fire safety inspections, records of hydrants, emergency access requirements. All of these, he knew, had to be in compliance in residential developments. And all of these, he suspected, were being neglected by an HOA too concerned with lawns and fences to pay attention to what truly mattered. By midday, his suspicions were confirmed. A quick search through city archives revealed troubling patterns. The fire hydrants in the community had not been serviced in years. Emergency lanes were blocked by decorative landscaping. Fire codes ignored. Safety violations buried under layers of paperwork. The HOA thought they were untouchable, but the father knew better. They weren't just vulnerable, they were exposed. That afternoon, he drove across town, not in his personal car, but in the marked vehicle that carried his title across the doors, Fire Chief. When he stepped out, heads turned. City workers nodded with respect. Doors opened that would have remained closed to anyone else. And with every step, he gathered the weight of evidence, the quiet storm that would soon break over his neighborhood. By the time he returned home, a thick folder sat in the passenger seat. Inside were photographs, inspection logs, legal codes, and violations that could cripple the HOA if brought into the light. He carried it into the house, set it on the table next to the stack of fines they had given him, and for the first time in weeks, the balance of power shifted. The family could feel it too. The mother watched him with quiet pride, sensing that the days of silent endurance were ending. The children, though still young, noticed the change in his posture, the certainty in his movements. He was no longer just their father. He was their defender, their shield, their champion. And yet, he remained patient. He didn't storm into the HOA office with his badge. He didn't shout down the board with threats. He knew revenge was sweetest when served not with anger, but with precision. So he waited again. He let the HOA make their next move. And of course, they did. The following weekend, the family again gathered in their backyard. Once again, the grill was lit. The smell of smoke and sizzling meat rose into the air, a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that they would not be broken. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some disapproving, others silently rooting for the family, and then, right on cue, the HOA appeared. This time, not just the president and a couple of board members. This time, they brought reinforcements. A full group of them marched down the sidewalk, armed with clipboards, cameras, and printed citations. They surrounded the yard like vultures, circling their prey. The father stood still, tending to the grill as though nothing were happening. He watched them approach, his calm demeanor only infuriating them more. They barked about violations, shouted about escalating fines, threatened legal action. Their voices rose, sharp and bitter, cutting across the neighborhood for all to hear. And then, the moment came. From the distance, a sound rose. Low at first, then growing louder. Sirens. The kind that made the ground tremble, the kind that turned heads on every street. The HOA members froze, their words caught in their throats as the first fire truck rounded the corner. Its red lights reflected off every polished lawn ornament, every pristine car in the driveways. And behind it, another truck, and another. The convoy roared down the street, stopping right in front of the family's house. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, stunned, whispering in confusion. What emergency had struck their quiet cul-de-sac? What fire demanded this response? The fire engines lined the street, men and women in uniform stepping down in practiced unison. And then, from the lead truck, a figure emerged. The father, the fire chief. The HOA president's jaw dropped, clipboard trembling in her hand. The board members looked at one another in disbelief, and the neighborhood, now fully gathered, realized the truth all at once. The man they had tried to break, the man they had buried in fines, was the highest fire authority in the city. He stood tall in his uniform, the badge glinting in the sunlight, and surveyed not just the HOA, but the entire street. The smoke rising from his grill had not called the fire department to his house. He had brought them here, on his own authority, to inspect the neighborhood itself. And what they were about to find would shake the HOA to its core. The fire engines sat like giants along the narrow suburban street, their hulking frames dwarfing the line of pristine houses. Red lights spun in steady rhythm, casting reflections on windshields, windows, and the frozen faces of HOA board members. What had begun as another act of harassment, a simple plan to shame a family over a barbecue, had turned into a spectacle that the entire neighborhood could not ignore. The father no longer stood as just a man by his grill. He stood in full uniform, the insignia of fire chief gleaming against his chest. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone carried authority that silenced every muttered threat and every whispered complaint. The HOA had prided itself on power, but in that moment, their clipboards looked like toys, and their rules like meaningless scribbles in the face of true law. The firefighters spread out with precision, moving as a unit. They carried inspection tools, hydrant gauges, and safety checklists. To the untrained eye, it may have seemed like an overwhelming show of force for a quiet neighborhood. But to anyone who understood fire safety, it was exactly what it needed to be. For fire codes were not about appearances. They were about survival. And the HOA, obsessed with manicured lawns and decorative hedges, had been blind to the danger simmering beneath their polished image. Neighbors gathered in clusters at the edge of their driveways, whispering to one another. Some were confused, others were thrilled. A few wore nervous expressions, knowing deep down that their HOA had cut corners for years. And the children, wide-eyed and excited, watched the massive engines with awe, not realizing the storm of consequences that loomed over their community. The inspections began quickly. A firefighter knelt by the hydrant at the corner, attaching a pressure gauge. The hiss of water and the numbers that appeared on his meter told the story instantly. Neglected maintenance. The hydrant's pressure was dangerously low, a violation that could cripple any emergency response in the event of a real fire. Another firefighter moved toward the cul-de-sac entrance, where the HOA had lined the road with decorative stones and flower beds. To residents, it was charming, a welcome feature. To fire crews, it was a barricade. Emergency vehicles would have been slowed, even blocked entirely, by the narrowed lane. Another violation, another strike against the board, and still more firefighters fanned out, documenting hazards. Overgrown trees too close to power lines, backyard fire pits without proper spacing, locked gates blocking required emergency access paths. Every discovery added weight to the folder of evidence the fire chief had already begun to build. Every finding chipped away at the facade of control the HOA had paraded around for years. The board members tried to recover, tried to regain composure. The president, her face pale but voice shrill, stammered about protocol and jurisdiction. She waved her clipboard like a shield, declaring that the HOA had rules, the HOA had authority, the HOA had the right to govern its community. But her words rang hollow against the backdrop of flashing lights and uniformed firefighters carrying out inspections backed by state and city law. The HOA's rules might have power over lawns and mailboxes, but they had no power here. Not against codes that carried the weight of life and death. As the chief walked the street, he noticed the shifting expressions of the residents. Some of those who had once turned away from his family now looked on with quiet respect, perhaps even guilt. Others, emboldened by the sight of the HOA finally being challenged, nodded subtly in his direction. The tide was turning, and it was turning quickly. The HOA president tried one last desperate move. She announced loudly that the fire department was wasting taxpayer resources on a stunt, that the chief was abusing his position for personal revenge. Her voice shook as she said it, but she clung to the words like they were her last defense. The chief did not respond with anger. He didn't need to, because even as she spoke, one of his firefighters called out from down the street. Another hydrant had failed inspection. The pressure was not just low, it was non-existent. A hydrant bone dry in the middle of a neighborhood packed with families and children. A hazard that could cost lives if disaster struck. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Shock, fear, betrayal. The HOA had been fining people for grass length and mailbox paint, all while ignoring the very systems meant to keep them alive. The president's face drained of color as she realized the truth. Her board had not just been petty, they had been negligent. And now, their negligence was being exposed in front of everyone they had claimed to protect. The chief lifted the failed inspection report in his hand, holding it steady for all to see. He didn't speak a word, but the silence that followed was louder than any argument. In that silence, the board members felt the weight of their crumbling authority. In that silence, the neighbors began to see clearly who had been protecting them all along. And it wasn't the HOA. The trucks lined the street like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The inspections were not over, and the violations were piling up faster than the board could deny them. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of their credibility. And, as the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the lawns, the father, the fire chief, knew this was only the beginning. Exposing their failures was step one. But he wasn't finished. He had bigger plans. Plans that would not only strip the HOA of its false power, but ensure they never threatened his family or anyone else's again. The HOA had wanted to play with fire. Now they were about to learn what it meant to be consumed by it. The neighborhood was still buzzing after the fire trucks left. Conversations spilled across driveways, whispered at fences, and echoed in living rooms where blinds had been carefully tilted open. The spectacle had done more than just embarrass the HOA. It had cracked their illusion of power. But embarrassment was not destruction. The HOA still held its grip through paperwork, bank accounts, and the fear it had instilled in residents for years. To truly dismantle their authority, the father knew he had to strike at the heart of their operation, not just in front of curious neighbors, but in their own domain. That chance came days later. A notice arrived in every mailbox. HOA mandatory board meeting. The language was stiff and defensive, calling for urgent clarification regarding recent events. It was clear the board felt their control slipping, and now they wanted to reclaim it. The father received the notice like every other homeowner. But unlike the others, he knew this meeting would not be theirs to control. It would be his. On the evening of the gathering, residents trickled into the community hall. The HOA president sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members. Their clipboards and stacks of printed rules lay in front of them like weapons, sharpened and ready to be used. They had rehearsed their speech, no doubt. They would claim the fire department's inspections were routine. They would insist they had everything under control. They would try to patch the holes in their sinking ship with arrogance and denial. But the father entered not as a man to be lectured. He entered as the chief. His uniform was not necessary tonight. His presence alone carried enough weight. The folder he carried under his arm, thick with inspection reports and photographs, was the real authority. The room filled with neighbors, some anxious, some curious, many angry. The air crackled with tension. This was no ordinary meeting. This was a reckoning waiting to unfold. The president began, her voice falsely cheerful but edged with strain. She spoke of misunderstandings and community image, painting the fire trucks as nothing more than a miscommunication. She framed the HOA as victims of exaggeration. But even as she spoke, eyes from the crowd shifted toward Yer, the father, waiting for his response. And then it came. When the president attempted to move to new business, the father stood. His movement silenced the room instantly. He laid the folder on the table, the heavy thud of it cutting through. Her carefully crafted words. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it. Page after page slid across the boardroom table. Hydrants with no pressure, access lanes blocked, safety violations that could cost lives. Each document was stamped with the authority of the city fire department, each one undeniable. The board, members leaned forward, their faces paling as the evidence spread before them. The president tried to interrupt, her voice rising with panic, but the chief continued, his narration steady, relentless. He spoke not as a neighbor with a grievance, but as the man responsible for protecting an entire city. He explained, point by point, how the HOA had neglected its most basic duty, ensuring the safety of its residents. The room erupted with whispers, gasps, and pointed stares. Neighbors who had once feared the board now saw them for what they truly were: negligent, reckless, and dangerous. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others demanded explanations. The walls of silence the HOA had built for years began to crumble piece by piece under the weight of truth. The president clung to her final defense: anger. She slammed her clipboard against the table and accused the chief of overstepping his role, of humiliating the board intentionally. She spat words like vendetta and personal attack, but her voice wavered, betraying the weakness behind her fury. And then the father dropped the final blow. He announced that the fire department would be issuing formal citations, not to residents, but to the HOA board itself. Fines, penalties, mandatory corrections. Legal consequences backed not by HOA rules, but by city law. The room fell silent. For the first time, the board had no power to fine, no power to threaten, no power to hide. They had become the violators. They had become the ones under scrutiny. Neighbors began to murmur, this time with anger not at the family who had grilled in their yard, but at the board that had failed them all. Demands for resignation rippled through the crowd. Calls for new leadership grew louder. Years of resentment, long buried under fear, began to surface. The president's face hardened, but her eyes betrayed the panic she could no longer mask. Her empire was collapsing in front of her, and the man she had once thought she could bully was the very one dismantling it brick by brick. The chief gathered his folder, leaving the documents scattered on the table like ashes after a fire. He didn't need to say more. His message was clear. The age of HOA intimidation was over. But as he walked out of the boardroom, he knew the fight wasn't finished. The HOA was cornered, humiliated, and desperate people often made reckless moves. The father had struck first in public, then in their boardroom. The question now was how far the HOA would go to protect what little power they had left. And as the night settled over the neighborhood, the silence felt heavy, almost dangerous. The calm before the storm. The boardroom humiliation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the following morning, whispers had become conversations, and conversations had become open rebellion. Homeowners who had once bowed to every demand of the HOA began questioning their authority. Some refused to pay their dues. Others posted copies of the fire department's citations in their windows as symbols of defiance. The HOA's empire, once untouchable, was crumbling. But humiliation has a way of transforming pride into fury. And for the president and her loyal board, the shame of being stripped bare in front of their neighbors was unbearable. They could not allow their legacy of control to end this way. They needed to strike back. And so, in the shadows of their collapse, desperation took root. The father's family noticed the change almost immediately. The letters, once steady and predictable, stopped arriving. The threats, once loud and public, shifted to silence. On the surface, it seemed as though the HOA had been defeated, retreating into shame. But the father knew better. Silence was rarely surrender. Silence was plotting. The signs were subtle at first. A car idling too long at the end of their street. A set of eyes watching from a passing window. Notes left not in the mailbox, but slipped under the door in the dead of night. Notes with no letterhead, no signature, just venomous words. Leave this neighborhood. You don't belong here. You'll regret what you've done. The mother grew uneasy. The children sensed the tension, but the father remained steady, though inside his anger grew. The HOA had abandoned rules and fines. Now they were turning to intimidation. And then came the act that shattered the thin veil of civility. One night, as the family slept, the sharp crack of glass broke the stillness. A rock, hurled through the front window, landed in the living room. Around it, shards of glass glittered in the moonlight. Taped to the rock was a scrap of paper with a single word, scrawled in haste. Out! The sound brought the father rushing. From his bed, his instincts sharpened not just by anger, but by years of leading men into dangerous, chaotic scenes. He scanned the street, but the perpetrator had vanished into the shadows. What lingered was not fear, but the confirmation of what he already knew. The HOA was cornered, and now they were lashing out. The following day, the family discovered more. Their car tires slashed, their trash can overturned and smeared with foul waste, subtle acts of sabotage that spoke not of leadership, but of desperation. The board was no longer functioning as an authority. They were acting as vandals, criminals, fighting to keep a grip on power that was already gone. Neighbors saw it too. Some offered quiet sympathy. Others, terrified of retaliation, turned away. But the tide of opinion was shifting. For every act of malice the HOA carried out, more residents realized the truth. The board had never been protectors. They had always been bullies. The father documented everything. Every note, every act of sabotage, every violation, captured and stored like evidence in a case he had been building from the start. He was no stranger to threats. He had faced far worse in the fires he commanded. But this was different. This was his home, his family, his sanctuary under siege, and that he could not allow to continue. The HOA president, though, refused to relent. At the next informal gathering, she addressed a dwindling circle of loyal followers with venom. She painted the father as an outsider, a usurper who had weaponized his position against them. She swore they would not be destroyed by him, that the HOA was bigger than one man. Her words dripped with defiance, but her audience was shrinking. And every day her credibility slipped further through her fingers. The father waited, biding his time. He had already crippled their reputation. He had already exposed their negligence. But now, with their desperation turning to criminal acts, he knew the end game had arrived. They had crossed a line, and he would not allow them to step back. And so, he prepared his final move. Late one evening, as the neighborhood settled into uneasy silence, the father sat once more at his kitchen table. But this time there was no stack of fines in front of him, no folder of inspection reports. Instead, there was a larger file, one prepared not just by the fire department, but by the city itself. A file that contained not just violations, but formal charges. A file that would be placed directly in the hands of law enforcement and city officials. For weeks, The HOA had believed they were fighting a battle of fines and control. They thought they were harassing one family. What they did not realize was that every step, every violation, every desperate act had been recorded, documented, and prepared for the final strike. The father closed the file, his decision made. The HOA had wanted to play with fire. But fire was not a game. Fire consumed, fire cleansed, fire left nothing of corruption standing. Tomorrow, the board would learn that truth the hard way. The morning arrived heavy with anticipation. Clouds gathered low over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the carefully trimmed lawns and pristine driveways. But beneath that polished surface, the heart of the HOA was rotten, and today, the rot would finally be exposed. The father rose early, dressed not in casual clothes but in his uniform, the dark navy of authority, the emblem of command on his chest, and the EA fire chief's badge polished until it gleamed. He was not leaving the house as a resident that morning. He was leaving as the very force the HOA had underestimated from the beginning. The file he carried was thick, pages upon pages of violations, citations, photographs, and sworn statements. Evidence of criminal harassment, evidence of financial misconduct, evidence of an HOA that had stopped protecting its neighborhood long ago and had instead turned into a cartel of control. The city council meeting was already packed when he arrived. Word had spread beyond the neighborhood. Residents, reporters, city officials, they all gathered, waiting to hear what the fire chief had to say. For weeks, rumors of the feud had circled, but today would be the day the truth came into the light. He stood before them and began to speak, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in the calm, measured cadence of a man who had faced roaring flames and chaos and refused to flinch. He laid the file on the table and opened it. He spoke of the illegal harassment of his family, of the intimidation tactics, of the sabotage. He spoke of fines weaponized not as community protections but as tools of cruelty. He spoke of the rock thrown through his window, the tires slashed, the children made to feel unsafe in their own home. And then, with precision, he spoke of the fire code violations, the ignored safety standards, the board's reckless disregard for rules they themselves demanded of others. He revealed financial records, dues siphoned, funds misused, money unaccounted for. Every word was another nail in the coffin of the HOA. The room grew tense. The council members leaned in. The residents, many of them victims themselves, sat straighter, their fear dissolving into hope. And as the father's words filled the chamber, the HOA president and her dwindling band of supporters sat stone-faced, their power slipping away with every passing second. When he finished, he closed the file. And then, with deliberate weight, he said the words that would shatter the board's illusion of control forever. The HOA in its current form is not only negligent, it is unlawful. And as fire chief, I am recommending full dissolution and city oversight effective immediately. The council voted. The decision was unanimous. The HOA was dissolved, its charter revoked. Its president and treasurer referred to law enforcement for investigation. Its authority stripped, its empire reduced to ashes. The neighborhood, once bound in fear, erupted. Not in chaos, but in relief. Neighbors who had once stayed silent stepped forward, shaking hands, thanking the father, pledging to rebuild the community not with fear, but with fairness. For the first time in years, the streets felt lighter. And yet, as the father returned home, he knew the true victory was not in the council's vote. The true victory was in the quiet strength of his family. They had endured the harassment. They had faced down the intimidation. And together, they had stood against a corrupt system until it collapsed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the smell of smoke drifted once again through the neighborhood. But this time, It was not the smoke of danger. It was the smoke of barbecue rising from the father's backyard. The grill sizzled, laughter echoed, and the community gathered, not to judge, not to fine, but to celebrate. The children ran, freely. The neighbors ate heartily, and the father stood by the flames watching them dance, not as a threat, but as a symbol. Fire could destroy, yes, but it could also cleanse. It could burn away corruption and leave behind the chance for something stronger to grow. The HOA had thought they could control him with fear. They had thought they could intimidate his family into silence. But in the end, they had only lit a spark they could not contain. And when fire burns, it leaves nothing of tyranny standing. The neighborhood was free, the family was safe, and the fire chief had done what he always did best. He had faced the flames, and he had come out victorious.